Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Matthew Beyer, and I am the Museum Education and Engagement Coordinator for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars, presented on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month, explore Iowa's history from pre-statehood to current day. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at history.iowa.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar you'd like to attend, and don't worry if you can't watch live. All presentations will be recorded. Today, we'll learn about the crucial roles played by Iowans in the failed construction of the Nicaragua Canal and discover how supposedly insular Midwesterners participated in networks of transnational capital that shaped Central America. Now, a few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into the webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I've disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague, Jennifer Cooley, is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not have time to get to all the questions. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our presenter for today, Nathan Chaplin. Nathan is a PhD candidate in history at University of Iowa. He is primarily interested in the history of public health, the history of imperialism, and Midwestern history. His dissertation focuses on the middlemen of U.S. empire, managers, bureaucrats, academics, and physicians, and the way they negotiated U.S. policy with Nicaraguan elites throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. And now I'm happy to turn it over to Nathan to begin the webinar.
Hi, thanks again to Jennifer and Matthew for hosting this series and for everyone else in attendance to learn about this really interesting chapter in Iowa history. So to start off, today we're going to be looking at the enormous contributions of a select group of Iowans to the numerous failed Nicaraguan Canal efforts throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. So up until 1902, it seemed fated that the United States would build their Trans-Isthmian Canal not through Panama, where it currently exists, but through Nicaragua instead. And there were a host of reasons for this choice. For one, Nicaragua was seen as a far healthier region than Panama. The French, who were attempting to build a Panama Canal at the time, experienced 22,000 deaths of yellow fever in just a decade of building. So Nicaragua was seen as much healthier in comparison. And there's a river, as you can see on this map, that nearly bisects Nicaragua in half. And so a lot of engineers theorized that they would need a lot less dredging to actually create the canal. And some even said this canal was sort of like the destiny of Nicaragua because it seemed like nature had almost split the country in half. There were also favorable trade winds, and the Nicaraguan government at times was seen as more cooperative. And not just the United States were interested in Nicaragua. At various moments, the French, the British, the German, the Japanese, and even today, the Chinese government are all in some way involved in attempting to build a canal through Nicaragua. But as we all know, these plans will fail, or did fail. Various companies in the US spent tens of millions of dollars, which would be billions of dollars adjusted for inflation. There were numerous invasions of US military forces and sort of private militias that attempted to throw over the Nicaraguan government in order to make it more favorable to a canal project. And there were dozens of private and publicly funded canal route surveys where academics from throughout the country, we're going to focus on Iowa, came to Nicaragua and sort of made their careers becoming specialists in the botany and environment of Nicaragua. So at the center of all of these projects, I'm going to argue, were Iowans. So we're going to be looking at what I'm calling 3 generations of Iowan canal builders. So first, we're going to look at how Iowans were involved in this national war against the filibusters, when sort of a private army, mostly from the US, tried to overthrow the Nicaraguan government in the 1850s. Particularly, we're going to look at why did Iowans decide to participate in this? Why did they see their involvement in Nicaragua as somehow connected to their own identities and their own lives back in the Midwest? And we're going to highlight a few stories of some pretty exceptional individuals and sort of why they decided to join up and how it sort of contrasts with the normal narrative of this period. Second, we're going to look at the actual work done on the Nicaraguan Canal. And as you'll see, most of the workers that we're going to highlight are going to be from Iowa, that are going to be actually working on the canal. And then finally, we're going to look at the eventual end result of the Nicaragua Canal and how the U.S. sort of eventually pulls away and the role Iowa plays there. Okay. So in the 1850s, a filibustering frenzy seized the United States. Now, by filibustering, I'm not referring to lengthy speeches before Congress. Instead, in the 1850s, filibustering had a very different meaning, coming from the Dutch term vrijbuiter, freebooter, essentially a pirate. Filibusters in the mid 19th century US context were private American soldiers working without sanction from any government, attempting to overthrow and incite rebellion in various Central American and Caribbean countries. Now, this really reached a fever pitch after the US victory in the Mexican American War, when this sort of doctrine of manifest destiny was propelling filibustering attempts in places as disparate as Cuba, Ecuador, Brazil, Hawaii. There were even like plans written up to invade Canada and Ireland. So this was like sort of a almost global phenomenon. But only one filibustering expedition encountered any modicum of success, and that was in Nicaragua, where a Nashville-born physician, attorney, journalist, sort of man of many hats named William Walker invaded in 1855. Now, a little background here. This was not his first foray into filibustering. In 1853, he had invaded Mexico with an army of about 45 men, and this immediately collapsed. He was literally chased out of the country on horseback by Mexican troops. Now, filibustering was illegal. It violated the Neutrality Act of 1794 in the United States, and Walker was tried in San Francisco. But there was such a sort of, you might say, desire for filibustering at the time that Walker was acquitted within 8 minutes by the jury, and there were even like people like cheering for him in the stands. So in October 1854, Walker has at this point gained some renown as sort of a famous figure of the filibustering movement. At that time, there's an ongoing civil war between the two dominant political parties in Nicaragua. Now, I don't want to overstate this political party. These are essentially just two elite parties, one called the Conservatives, based in Granada, and one called the Liberals and Leon. But they're basically just arguing over who gets to be in control of the government. There isn't really any ideological clash between these two groups. The Liberals were losing the civil war. The current president was sort of doing some repression against their political movement, and so they decided to call for aid. Now, there are many reasons they decided to do this. I mean, first and foremost, a lot of liberals had met Americans during the gold rush. Nicaragua was the most popular route to get to California from the East Coast. So they had encountered Americans and were like, oh, like we want Americans to settle here and like decide to invest their capital in our country. They also had a negative view of a man named Cornelius Vanderbilt, who owned the transit route, in particular because Vanderbilt, when he bought the right to the transit route, promised that he would also build the canal and had made no effort whatsoever and had recently refused to pay taxes on the route either. He was saying he wasn't making any money, but the Nicaraguan government was saying that's not the case. With all that background, the Liberal Party turns to Walker and asks him for help. They say, can you come? We want you to do a new filibustering mission in Nicaragua, join the Liberal Army, and help us overthrow the Conservatives. They asked him to bring 300 men and offered free farmland and Nicaraguan citizenship to any American who joined up. Now, Walker initially was very favorably received. His army was called the Immortals. There are only about 59 of them, not 300. But with their help, the Liberals were able to win the Civil War against the Conservatives, and Walker was made general. And he picks a nonpartisan president, sort of not strongly aligned with either party, Patricio Rivas, to serve as sort of a figurehead president while Walker is in control from the shadows. He's so popular that in the U.S. there is a like long-running Broadway musical that I have the handbill up on the screen that sort of like celebrates the victories of the filibustering and is calling for more people to join up and enlist in this project. Walker allies with many peasant leaders who are sort of outside of this traditional binary between the conservatives and the liberals. And he seizes Vanderbilt's boats along the projected canal route, which is initially received very well by the Nicaraguan people. They think he's going to actually start this work of building the canal. That's in part why they asked him to come. But within a year, this is all falling apart. Walker holds a sham election after a disagreement with Rivas and usurps the presidency. He does do this project of land redistribution. He seizes the farmlands of wealthy conservatives and liberals, but he redistributes them to wealthy Americans, not to the peasant people as he had promised. As Costa Rica and the Conservative Party and even some liberals form a sort of coalition army with backing from Cornelius Vanderbilt, they're quickly winning this war to kick him out of the country, and Walker burns down the old, beautiful colonial city of Granada, which earns him just eternal hate from the Nicaraguan people. And then finally, right before he leaves, he re-legalizes slavery, which had been abolished for several decades in Nicaragua. Now, this has proved very difficult for many historians because they associate the entire sort of filibustering movement then with slavery, because Walker did re-legalize slavery. But as I hope to show today, it wasn't just Southerners who joined the filibusters. There are actually a lot of reasons that people in Iowa would become interested. Yeah. So basically, his reign of terror at the end of his career, and particularly his eventual ties to Southern enslavers, has obscured the reasons that Midwesterners would join up. So let's look at why Iowans in particular would decide to join the filibuster movement. I mean, at the most basic level, filibusters were promised 250 acres of farmland, or 500 acres if they brought their family. Thousands of people would take up this offer. There's really no easier way to get farmland than for free. In the Midwest, there were constant ads for the filibuster campaign. I have a few up on the screen right now that emphasize the agricultural and environmental similarities of Nicaragua in the Midwest. So, like in an Iowa ad, one recruiter wrote, quote, "The soil of the Mississippi Valley and the western states far excel in productiveness the famed Egyptian Nile banks, but the Midwest may offer the most arable and valuable lands known, yet face the drawback of winter, unlike Nicaragua." Right? So he's drawing a comparison here between, he says, this farmland that people have recently acquired on the Iowan frontier is great. But in Nicaragua, it's basically the same, except you can farm it the entire year round. He also noted that all of the crops that were, grown in frontier states, he names corn, barley, beans, peas, root vegetables. He says all of these grow just as well in Nicaragua, but you also can grow tropical fruits. There's just these abundant opportunities for farmers. A recruiter in Ohio compared Ohio explicitly to Chantal's and said, just like in Ohio, you see, quote, thousands of acres of rolling prairie. Okay. This leads to a sort of his ultimate picture of Nicaragua in Iowan ads is, quote, a great country for a lazy man, right? That even the laziest farmer in Iowa could go to Nicaragua and reap these rewards because it's just so easy to farm there. That's sort of the picture these ads are trying to craft. Even explicitly anti-slavery publications like the Iowa Republican in Iowa City, they supported filibustering up until Walker re-legalizes slavery in 1857, and they stressed the relative safety of Nicaragua for Iowans. In a review of George Byam's Wildlife in the Interior of Central America, in which the British travel writer argued that all tropical regions were inherently deadly to Anglo-Saxon people, an Iowa City author claimed that the San Juan region, so this is the route, what would be the route of the canal, was as healthy as possible for a tropical region, right? So sort of explicitly combating these myths that other people have about how dangerous Nicaragua is. Many Iowans would then heed Walker's call and join the filibusters. I have up in the top corner the literal regiment roll of when men got to Managua and enlisted in Walker's army. He wrote down who came with them and made sure that they're on paper were receiving farmland. And as you'll see there are men from Muscatine, there are men from Des Moines, from sort of all over Iowa are joining this project. But I want to highlight three pretty exceptional stories. First, I want to talk about Eleanor Callahan, who is a white woman from Council Bluffs who published an account, like sort of a memoir of her time in Nicaragua, and Chess, who was an enslaved African American man who Eleanor actually brought with her to Nicaragua. Sort of see how they have two very different experiences of what it means to be a filibuster and an Iowan. And then finally, I want to look at the story of John Rapier Jr., who becomes the first Black graduate west of the Mississippi in any medical school in the west of the Mississippi. Okay, so so Eleanor and Chess left Council Bluff with Eleanor's sister's family, as so her sister's family and her brother on April 4, 1856. And this is sort of roughly in the middle of the filibustering state, right? Walker is about to seize the presidency. Things are looking pretty popular right now. In her published memoir with Walker in Nicaragua, she notes that this is not the only family that is going on her, like on the boat that she's taking. She notes there's 6 other families on voyage, so it's not just soldiers; it's also like people are trying to settle on this like new frontier. She says that their mission is, quote, to Americanize that garden of the world. Now, most of her family that goes with her dies within the first year in Nicaragua. I believe her sister falls ill from a fever almost immediately, and then like her brother-in-law dies in the war, her niece dies, and basically all that's left is her brother, and Chess. They're the only ones who sort of make it through this. In her account, she's present for many of the most iconic moments in the national war against the filibusters, when sort of the Costa Rican army pushes Walker out of Nicaragua, including the Second Battle of Rivas, where she remarks that she's nearly killed by a cannonball. She's like in a little cottage hiding with her brother-in-law. They're having a conversation, and a cannonball like pierces through right by their heads. As she runs away from this, she joins up with the filibuster army. She doesn't take up a weapon, but she takes her skirt and sort of rips it up into wadding so that the men can use it to like clean out the cannon so they can keep firing. In this Battle of Rivas, Costa Rica's national hero Juan Santamaria, who's this drummer boy who basically gives his life to defeat the filibusters, to throw a torch and destroy where a bunch of them are hiding. She may have witnessed this. It's unclear. It's not in her memoir, but she's in that city when this is happening. And Juan Santamaria is now like the airport in Costa Rica is named after him. He's a very important figure in Costa Rican nationalism. So after Walker's defeat in 57, initially Callahan decides to leave. She goes to San Juan and is preparing to leave, but she hears there are rumors that Walker is going to come back, that he's just going to go back, get up a new army, and return to Nicaragua. So she decides to stay. She finds work as a shop assistant for a British woman's shop for about 4 years, but she seems to be treated pretty poorly there. And eventually, Walker gets executed in 1860, and she decides, I need to get out of here. Like, this is not, he's never coming back. I need to get back to the United States. But for Chess, the move to Nicaragua, while for Eleanor Callahan, she sort of lost her farmland, lost most of her family, and ended up in like a very poor situation. For Chess, the move to Nicaragua presented an opportunity for freedom. Now, it is unclear how long during Callahan's journey that he stays with her, but in 1857, when she first tried to leave San Juan, she can't find Chess at the port. And so she starts asking around to all these white patrons at the port, saying, hey, have you seen Chess? He's enslaved to me. I'd like to bring him back to the United States. And the governor of San Juan comes and visits her and tells her explicitly that if she took Chess out of Nicaragua, she would suffer according to military law. So this sort of inverts any understanding of the filibuster movement, that it's about slavery. Like, Chess is using it to gain his freedom that has been denied him elsewhere. Now, their stay in Nicaragua teaches us a few things. First, the filibustering did provide some surprising opportunities for some Black Iowans, as we will continue to see with Rapier. And two, that most Iowan filibusters never claimed any of this promised farmland, right? Despite the way that it was advertised to them, most of them never actually get any of this land that they came for. So John Rapier Jr., he decided to join William Walker for some pretty interesting reasons. He was born in Alabama, left Alabama after experiencing racist oppression, and with his uncle James Thomas, who actually happened to be a friend of William Walker back in Nashville. Thomas basically tells Rapier that they will be able to find work and upward mobility in Nicaragua. So the two of them joined the filibustering movement. Um, John Rapier, in his sort of publications about this, reminiscences of a filibuster for a Minnesota paper. He notes that there are like some black people who are actually in power in Nicaragua, and that impresses him. But he quickly becomes disillusioned, watches Walker's downfall, and leaves. And he sort of cycles throughout a bunch of frontier regions, right? He goes to Minnesota, then he goes to Jamaica, Haiti. He's sort of bouncing around all of these places that we wouldn't necessarily in 2023 think is connected. But to him, these are all places he thinks he can find upward mobility in. In his letters home from Jamaica, he writes that while he felt persecuted in Haiti on account of his race, because he was mixed race, in Jamaica he felt comfortable. So he finally found a place that he felt at home, and he gets a job as a dental assistant. Now, at this point, talking with the dentist he's working with, they decide if you ever want to advance any further, you need to go to medical school. And you're not going to be able to get into a medical school back in the United Kingdom because you're American, but you might be able to get into some in the US that are recognized by the United Kingdom, and then you can work in Jamaica. So he selects Michigan as his first choice. He wants to go there because their medical degree is recognized by the British. Now, he is one of the first black men to attend the University of Michigan, alongside his classmate, Alpheus W. Tucker, who's actually from Michigan. Tucker experienced harassment by the majority white student body. He received jeers and slurs on his first day in class, and by the end of the week, he was expelled explicitly on account of his race. The dean physically scratched his name out of the record book. Now, Tucker faced this oppression despite the fact that this is during the Civil War, and Michigan strongly supports the Union in the ongoing war. As he writes in an op-ed, he decries this injustice, despite his status as, quote, a native of the state and a supporter of the university through his taxes. So he's basically saying there's a lot of people at Michigan who aren't even from Michigan, and yet I'm being denied this solely because I'm black. Rapier also faces hostility from his peers, but he is not expelled. Unlike Tucker, he is able to remain. And this is perhaps because when he applied to Michigan, he presented himself not as an African American man from Alabama, but as a mixed race potential medical student from Kingston, Jamaica. So he's sort of crafting a new identity for him to chase this medical degree. But it still must have been unpleasant enough that he decides to transfer after a year to Iowa College in Keokuk, Iowa at the time, but it's now become the University of Iowa. And he quickly finished his degree there. Now, again, he applies as a Jamaican, despite the fact that he's from Alabama. And this seems to have lasted into sort of modern days, this confusion about who Rapier is. As of 2016, he is still listed as Iowa's first international student, despite the fact that he was born in Alabama. After finishing medical school, he quickly enlists in the Civil War and becomes a surgeon at the Freedmen's Hospital in Washington, D.C., where this photograph is taken. Now, Rapier's story, and as well as Tucker's story, they remind us that these historic firsts do not always signify the absence of inequality or oppression. It also demonstrates the deep connections between the young, sort of new frontier of Iowa and Nicaragua in the 1850s. They both existed as sort of similar types of spaces where you could find upward mobility for a limited group of white and black Iowans. Okay. Now, following Walker's defeat and execution, and his outright refusal to make any progress on the Nicaragua Canal, despite his many promises, it would be safe to assume that many elites in Nicaragua would turn against the United States. So they would say, we don't want another Walker situation to happen. But this really doesn't happen. For a few years, elites in Nicaragua are sort of focused on unity between the conservatives and the liberals. But at the end of the day, the party that's really marred by Walker's failures is the Liberal Party. Within a decade, the conservative elites are once again willing to work with the United States, willing to sign canal concessions to the United States. The Conservative Party holds the presidency for the next 30 years of consecutive conservative governance. And they use the competition between the United States and Great Britain to get sort of more favorable work done on the canal, right? So essentially, like you offer it to the United States. If the United States doesn't do anything, you switch it back to Great Britain and sort of play the two against each other. By 1884, though, the Nicaraguan government under Adán Cárdenas de Castillo granted the canal concession to the U.S. for essentially the last time, to a sort of mixture of government and private interests. Cardenas is especially interesting because he also funded scientific research by some University of Iowa professors who came to his hacienda, large agricultural estate in Nicaragua, to do work. So the conservative government first grants the canal rights to the Nicaragua Canal Association. This is going to get a bit complicated here because all of these organizations call themselves some variation of Nicaragua Canal, but I'm going to try to explain the differences right here at the outset. So they give it to the Canal Association, which is essentially a bunch of New York businessmen with ties to transcontinental railroads. These men do nothing with it. They essentially just sit on it and wait for it to go up in value. The Nicaraguan government is very unhappy with this, revokes the grant, and gives it instead to the Maritime Canal Company of Nicaragua. Now, the Maritime Canal Company is far and away the most successful of any of these companies. It's sort of a unique company. It's formed by an act of Congress in 1881, so all of its stockholders are mostly politicians, and it's led by a New York senator named Warner Miller. Miller also owned a sizable stake in the Nicaragua Canal Construction Company, a different company, which owned the actual dredging machines that would be used to dig any canal in Greytown. So what happens is the Maritime essentially contracted the actual labor of building the canal to the construction company in exchange for giving them the grant to work. It's just like very complicated corporate stuff. But many of the same investors are in the construction company, but this company is open to the public and is, well, as we'll see, does a ton of recruiting targeting Midwesterners to try to get them to buy into the company or work for the company. Now, to make this whole thing even more complicated, in the Midwestern press, all of these groups are invariably referred to as the Nicaragua Canal Company, when none of them have that name. When possible, I'll try to distinguish between them. So, under the leadership of Warner Miller, the Maritime and the Construction Company made a significant amount of progress in Nicaragua. They build a sizable headquarters in Greytown, supposed to be the Atlantic port of the canal. They build a modern hospital, some temporary and permanent housing for American and Jamaican workers. They spend $5 million surveying the route, making sure they have the precise flow of all the rivers. They cut down a bunch of trees along the route. They do some exploratory digging. They rejuvenate the harbor. And at this point, the canal is viewed very favorably by many Iowans. It's seen as really important to Iowan identity. The Iowan Republican, Democratic, and even the Populist Party, they all sign party platforms that affirm the necessity of the Nicaragua Canal to the party, right? They connect it to this new ideology of navalism, to defending the U.S. Navally, and they see that sort of, oddly enough, Iowa should play a role in this through building the Nicaragua Canal. Now, this enthusiasm manifested in the 1892 Nicaragua Canal Convention in St. Louis, which both aimed to spread news about the success of these two canal companies and unite interested parties throughout the nation, right? So they're trying to attract new investors and then bring the old investors into conversation with each other. Iowans played a central role in these proceedings. Captain John Festus Mary, who I've pictured right here, he was the president of the Iowa Nicaragua Canal Association, was named a featured speaker at the event, and he sort of almost stole the event. Drawing from his experience working for the Illinois Central Railroad, where he worked as a general passenger agent for Western lines, he knew how to sell stuff, and he knew how to sell the canal to Midwesterners. He highlighted the ways it would tie together all of the United States, proclaiming that, quote, every farmer, workman, and tradesman of the interior of the Midwest could be benefited by this immense increase of trade. This would be as important to Midwestern workers as, quote, the navigation of the Mississippi River and the lakes of the North, right? Again, he's linking the built environment of the Midwest to Nicaragua in a way not dissimilar to those filibustering ads from the 1850s. While other speakers focused on the benefits in California or the South, or even just for Wall Street investors, Mary focused on Middle America. Now, Mary's successful speech brought him wide acclaim. He was named chairman of the propaganda committee of the Nicaragua Canal Convention. His speech was plastered on the front page of newspapers across the United States, and he would write the official summary of the canal's benefit that was sent to the U.S. government. So he sort of becomes, in many ways, the voice of Nicaragua Canal. He also becomes a celebrity in Iowa. The Cedar Rapids Gazette, to who he's constantly feeding stories about how important the Nicaragua Canal is, they write that, quote, due to him, more than any other one man is due the general interest in the Nicaragua Canal enterprise. At a later canal convention in New Orleans, he tells delegates that they need to manifest enthusiasm for the canal through their local press, just as he did in Cedar Rapids and in Iowa. Okay, but while Mary won support for the canal in Iowa, another Iowan helped build the canal. Now, there's a chance that Mary and Charles Payson Treat, who we're going to talk about here, actually knew each other. They both served in the 46th Iowa Volunteer Regiment during the Civil War. It's unclear if they ever, met during the war. Now, Treat does some of those. It's one of the largest successes of the Nicaragua Canal Construction Company. He builds a railroad. Now, this was an enormous challenge, and he was under immense pressure. I mean, to start, for the canal to work, for it to ever be built, they needed to build an 1,800-foot breakwater to turn Greytown, which, despite it's a city on the coast, but doesn't actually have a functioning harbor. So if they want to make it the eastern port of the canal, they need to rebuild it, essentially. And to do this, they need a large supply of stones and bricks. But they quickly exhausted the supply in the surrounding area. So the only way to get them quickly was through a railroad. Likewise, the railroad would be a necessity for carrying any dirt that was dug up and moving it throughout the country, right? So to actually dredge it, you needed a functioning railroad. Now, this was an immense task. The Nicaraguan government had been unable to connect the Mosquito Coast, the name for the eastern coast of Nicaragua, to the rest of the country for decades, right? They had a functioning railroad from Granada to Leon to Managua to like all of the big important cities on the western side. But the Atlantic side was essentially a separate country at this point, right? It has its own economy. It basically has its own government, right? We're going to talk about some rebellions and revolutions, and almost all of them start on the Mosquito Coast because it's so separated from the rest of the country. And it's separated because there is thick swamp, rainforest, dense vegetation in this region. So to do this, Treat modifies a strategy that was popular during the Civil War. He builds what's called a corduroy road. That's what I have pictured there is a corduroy road built in Nicaragua about a decade later. So this isn't actually Treat's railroad. It's a follower of his. So what you do is you lay logs perpendicular to the planned railroad and build over top of it, sort of drilling into those logs. Treat's innovation was that he then would bring a small cart full of sand and dump this heavy sand over the logs, forming a more secure roadbed for the eventual railroad. Now, Treat's strategy actually was successful. He's the first man to build a railroad in this region, and it goes 10 miles, which was quite a distance. But this plan was incredibly labor intensive. It relied on underpaid Jamaican laborers hauling trees by hand through this murky and disease-infested swamp water. So while Mary and his fellow propagandists for the Nicaragua Canal Construction Company trumpeted the relatively low mortality rates of white workers in Nicaragua, right? Mary claimed that white workers in Nicaragua had a lower mortality rate than white workers on the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, but he neglected to mention this large toll of Jamaican workers that essentially goes unreported. Now, by 1893, only a year later after the railroad was finished, the prospects for the canal had drastically declined. Um, Jose Santos Zelaya and the Liberal Party won a long-lasting civil war against the conservative government, ending 30 years of conservative government that had been very favorable to the U.S., and it was thought that maybe Zelaya would not be friend to the U.S. Likewise, in Panama, the company had basically, the French Panama Canal Company had essentially went bankrupt, and tens of thousands of people had died of mostly of yellow fever. So this was starting to spook some investors in the canal. And perhaps most ominously, in 1892, Warner Miller planned a trip to Nicaragua where he's going to bring a bunch of potential new money to see Treat's new railroad. That was like why they went to Nicaragua, to see this railroad, to see the successes that Treat had worked on. But on their way there, their ship actually crashed at sea, and it was stranded on an island of guano, of bat crap, for several days. It was sort of an ominous tiding for the future plans of the canal. So, into this crisis, Warner Miller paid two botanists from the University of Iowa to go to Nicaragua and report on how the route is going. Now, the two men who are appointed, Bohemil Shimmick and Charles Leonard Smith, are not the first Iowans to be paid to go to Nicaragua. As we mentioned earlier, Charles Nutting, an ornithologist, was also paid to come visit Nicaragua in 1884. And they also weren't the first choices of Warner Miller. He actually first asked Thomas McBride, for who McBride Hall is named in Iowa, if he would go, but he basically said, as a sort of tenured faculty member, that he was too busy to do this and suggested these two young instructors go in his place, which Miller agrees to. In Iowa, this trip is like very favorably reported on. The Iowa papers are very excited about Miller's involvement. They emphasize that he has benevolently rendered them, quote, free transportation and all assistance necessary for their scientific work and the investigation of flora. They expected that this trip would result in, quote, large additions to the newly formed University of Iowa Herbarium and the Museum of Natural History. So there's a lot of pressure on this trip. Shimmick and Smith essentially recreate the planned route of the Nicaragua Canal. They first go to Greytown, probably see Charles Payson Treat's railroad. Then they ride up the Rio San Juan to Ometepe Island and Lake Managua. Right, I've sort of numbered all of the locations they stop at on this map. And doing this, they're following the route of the canal and collecting thousands of vascular plants, ferns, mosses, fungi for the University of Iowa. In Shimmick's journals, despite their successful collections, he seems to detest his time in Nicaragua. He constantly complains about his hosts. He complains about their cooking. In particular, he writes on numerous days, he puts in all caps, no beans today, like celebrating that there's a change of food. He receives in what he feels are poor accommodations. But when he returns to Iowa City, his bags are stuffed with fungi and mosses. They're going to make his career. They're going to lead to great success for both him and Smith. So back in the States, he becomes a vocal advocate of the Nicaragua Canal. He's sort of echoing many of Mary's talking points regarding the health of the climate, right? The safety of building in Nicaragua. He emphasizes the potential profitability of the venture for Midwesterners, and he brings back 12 large boxes of rare botanical specimens for the University of Iowa, suggesting that Nicaragua could also be a profitable place for academics as well. At the same time, he constantly makes derogatory statements regarding the people and culture of Nicaragua, suggesting that they need U.S. involvement. Contrasting Nicaragua to Iowa City, he calls Nicaragua, quote, a small country inhabited by small people who build small houses, raise small domestic animals, and do everything on the small scale, quote. So in his mind, I'm clear, this is in his mind, Nicaragua needed an Iowan element to reinvigorate the nation, right? To sort of actually build these tall buildings that he says are in Iowa City. So ultimately, Miller was going to fail largely because of men like Bohemil Shimmick and John Festus Mary. Critics accused him of wasting the canal construction company's funds on these pointless conventions throughout the country in places like St. Louis, as well as his numerous attempts to create public opinion in different parts of the country through funding, scientific trips like Shimmick and Smith's. After Miller's dismissal, a conglomerate of New York investors led by John Bartlett tried to reorganize the company. Essentially, they tried to increase their shares in both the maritime and the construction at the detriment of the rest of these sort of smaller shareholders. This was opposed by a rival committee led by Frederick Hatch, which noted that the proposed plan essentially further consolidates control of both companies into this one reorganization committee, right? Hatch is basically saying this is a farce. Like, you're pretending these are two separate companies, but now they're all being turned into one, and you're getting double the shares. Hatch's main ally in this battle were the Pacific Coast stockholders, led by William L. Mary, no relation to John Festus. William believed that reorganization was not just a way to consolidate stock, but was actually a vile conspiracy being perpetuated by transcontinental railroad interests. They thought to stamp out at the beginning any potential rival to the trans-Isthmian travel, which like the canal would be. For evidence, he pointed out that the reorganization committee had hired the attorney for the Southern Pacific Company, which owned the Southern and Central Pacific Railroads and was led by Collis P. Huntington, one of the most vocal opponents to the Nicaragua Canal in the United States. So he's saying they're intentionally sort of drawing from the same pool to oppose us. So Hatch and Mary's plan then is to appeal to stockholders in the Midwest. They see that, like, basically they're not going to win over New York. Bartlett and his team have New York, but they might be able to convince enough small stockholders in places like St. Louis, Des Moines, Cincinnati, that they can sort of gang up and defeat reorganization. They run ads calling for stockholder support in Cincinnati, St. Louis, Chicago. Mary hires dozens of agents to publicly propagandize against reorganization. I have a list of all the towns he sent, how many agents they send out, and the plurality of the agents are actually sent to the Midwest, more than any other region. They don't just want to propagandize against reorganization, they also want to solicit further investment by Midwesterners in the Nicaragua Canal companies. While Hatch and Mary's gambit ultimately fails, their centering of the Midwest in the canal construction continues within the reorganized company. In 1897, Henry Isaac Sheldon, working for, I believe, the Maritime, in his account of the Nicaragua Canal efforts, writes that ultimately, quote, the central states will have the deciding vote on the interoceanic canal. But as we'll see, this vote is going to be no. In 1902, Congress is going to vote in favor of Panama over Nicaragua. And this is despite the findings in both 1899 and 1901 by the Isthmian Canal Commissions that Nicaragua was still the better route. There are numerous factors at play here why the U.S. decides to go with Panama. I mean, at the most basic level, the French Panama Canal Company drastically lowers their asking price in a sale to the U.S., and this seems to make it a lot cheaper to build in Panama. But there are other reasons at play too. There's a popular story about a volcano stamp. A French lobbyist happened to find a 1900 1-cent stamp featuring the Momotombo volcano, 100 miles from the proposed canal route. And I have an image of its distance up here. In Nicaragua, in this image, the volcano is spewing smoke and lava. This was particularly persuasive because just a week prior to the vote, the Saint Martinique volcano had erupted and claimed 30,000 lives. So essentially, this French lobbyist is saying, like, look, Nicaragua is just as dangerous. Volcanoes will destroy any canal built there. But the volcano argument actually had much earlier roots in the Midwest. A University of Minnesota geologist, Newton Winchell, pronounced loudly throughout the 1890s the seismic dangers of Nicaragua. He used the American Geological Society, founded by him and his brother, to constantly publish articles on the dangers of Nicaraguan volcanoes and earthquakes, trying to represent it as a dangerous space. At the same time, James J. Hill, another Minnesotan and founder of the Transcontinental Great Northern Railroad, he repeated Winchell's arguments about the danger of eruptions. But he goes a step farther. Well, Winchell always couched his arguments within the language of scientific jargon. He would, say all these things about seismic readings in Nicaragua and the amount of rainfall. He would always say, but, leave this question to the engineers and the politicians. I'm just telling you, how it works. Hill is explicit. He says the Nicaragua Canal would be of no value to the great interior of this country. He calls it, in his words, the Great Isthmian Ditch. That would ultimately be the death knell for the Nicaragua Canal. But even in the final act, sort of the epilogue of this story, Iowans play a key role. Following the U.S. sponsored overthrow of Zelaya in about 1913, 1914, a group of Iowans, including Clifford Ham, Irving, and Augustus Lindbergh, are appointed dollar diplomats in Nicaragua. This means basically that they are control of Nicaraguan banking apparatus, financial matters, the collection of customs, and the use of taxes in the country. Now, they received these positions largely because of their supposed distance from Wall Street interests, right? They're seen by the Nicaraguan people as sort of unbiased Midwesterners, right? They're compared, that's how they're spoken of in Nicaragua. And these Wall Street interests are seen as aligned against the Liberal Party. So they're seen as sort of a countermeasure. But when the U.S. signs a treaty with Nicaragua in 1914, which grants the canal rights in Nicaragua in perpetuity, in eternity, to the U.S. in exchange for only $3 million, these dollar diplomats assure the same Wall Street bankers that overthrew Zelaya, they assure them this money is going to go back to them, right? Those banks had loaned Nicaragua a great deal of money during the war, and they said that canal money is going to go back through to Wall Street through Iowan hands. Some of these men would stick around in Nicaragua for decades. Irving Lindbergh would become close friends with the eventual dictator, Anastasio Somoza, who's the Somoza family rules Nicaragua for decades. And he's the only other man in Nicaragua during that entire period to ever be granted the title of general. He keeps his position as in charge of sort of financial matters, and he also gets a new title from his buddy, Taco. Clifford Ham's map that he creates, I have a picture of it up here. He creates it in the 1920s. He enjoyed map making. That is used by Somoza and the U.S. Marines to combat revolutionary Sandinos in the 1930s. So these men have a lasting impact on Nicaraguan history. So, in conclusion, Iowans are involved in Nicaragua Canal efforts throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and this was not coincidental. Their experiences on the Iowan frontier as farmers, as settlers, as railroad workers, botanical and geographical surveyors, as advertisers, this prepared them for the difficult work of canal building and canal fundraising in Nicaragua. Ultimately, Iowans were heavily invested in Nicaragua Canal efforts and played a large role that's often ignored in shaping these separate eras of Nicaraguan history. Thank you so much for your time. I believe now is time for some questions.
Great. Thank you, Nathan. As he said, we do have some time for questions. And if you have any, please enter them into the Q&A feature on Zoom. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Nathan, I wanted to start out by asking, how did you become interested in this topic?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. A few years ago, I was doing a project on the filibusters and just looking at doctors who worked with the filibusters. And I was looking through the recruitment regiments. I showed an image on one of my slides. I found that there were a bunch of Iowans listed in it, and that seemed really weird to me because basically all I knew about the filibusters is that they were like committed to spreading slavery. And I was like, this seems weird that there are a bunch of like Iowan men who bring their entire families with them to Nicaragua. That doesn't seem in line with this story. And sort of as I dug into it and looked throughout Nicaraguan history, I kept seeing these Iowans playing a key role, and that sort of drew me in to this subject.
So you talk about the filibusters in your response. Why were they so popular with the public?
With the public in the U.S. or in Nicaragua?
In Nicaragua.
Yeah. Well, they're popular in Nicaragua because, I mean, the Conservative Party is very unpopular. It's a very repressive regime. The Liberal Party is also fairly unpopular. But a lot of Nicaraguans have relationships with Americans. Like a bunch of Americans like build hotels in Nicaragua during the gold rush and sort of stay there for the next decade. And so a lot of Nicaraguans are basically like, we want to be like they call them Norte Americanos. We want to be like you. We want to copy that. And we think the best way to do that is to basically pay a bunch of you to come live here with us. Right. So they don't, in their minds, Walker is not coming to like be a tyrant and take over the country. He's there to like teach them. And like he's a physician and an attorney. Like those are things they talk about. They're like, we're gonna learn these, he's going to help us. Yeah.
Interesting. And so to pick up off of that, so you talked about all these buildings being built, how the land was cleared, Americans' involvement in Nicaraguan politics. But after the canal failed, were the people of Nicaragua any better off because of the colonialism, or did it set the country back?
Yeah, I think like there are some benefits of like the canal attempts, right? There is some capital that goes into the country because of it, but I would say ultimately it's pretty devastating, right? Like as I've mentioned, the U.S. constantly sort of plays a role in overthrowing the Nicaraguan government like several times through this period, to get a more favorable government, right? Like one of the reasons they try to stop Zelaya is because they think he'll take the canal concession. And the only reason he gets to stay in power is because he realizes that if he does that, he'll be overthrown as well. So he's like, no, I'll work with you on the canal. I'm going to talk about stopping U.S. interests, but like behind closed doors, I'll work with you because you'll overthrow me as they eventually do.
Interesting. All right, so we've got some logistical questions. Do you think the Nicaraguan canal would have been better from a technical standpoint as opposed to the Panama Canal?
Um, Honestly, probably not. Um, the way they just really didn't think about how it would have to work. You have to just build a lot more locks because the San Juan River is not sea level. So it just take a lot more like engineering know-how to do it. Like it would have been more difficult. And there was actual work done in Panama already. So like Nicaragua Canal seems easier, but the Panama it's more effective.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Um, can you talk a little bit more about why Iowans were so interested in Nicaragua overall, but especially during the Civil War?
Yeah, I would say that like during the actual Civil War, I don't think Iowans are really thinking about Nicaragua at all. Um, but like in that period before, like about that decade before, I think it's interesting because like Iowa's a relatively new state. I mean, Minnesota's not a state yet. And I think these people are basically being like, well, I missed the boat in Iowa. I didn't get my free land. I go to Nicaragua instead. This seems to be working. Because like for a year, it's like Walker is like celebrated as a hero, and the filibusters are seen as like doing really important work. I mean, the president at the time recognizes Walker's government as legitimate. Like for like a very brief period of time, they're very successful, and then it all comes crumbling down. So I think that's sort of why they were interested. And then like following the Civil War, I think they get interested because they've acquired skills during the Civil War. I mean, dark as this sound, they've acquired skills that will be useful in canal building. Like they saw some horrific things, and actually, as I talk about with Treat, like that experience is useful for him.
All right, thank you. So obviously you talked a lot about Iowans today because that's the state that we live in. But were other folks in other states across the nation also having the same interest in Nicaragua, or was it primarily Iowans?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, it's this interest in Nicaragua is spread throughout the country. Um, Primarily when historians talk about it, they pretty much just talk about New York because there's a lot of like these like very wealthy railroad tycoons that get invested in it. Some to try to stop it, others is like sort of another way to make money. And then people talk about California because California is basically we want any way to get here faster, right? The canal, it's just a new way to get money into our economy. But I talk about Iowans because I think they play just as large of a role. Just no one thinks about them because they're in the middle of the country. Like it doesn't when you're thinking from a 2023 perspective, it seems odd that they would be interested, but they very much are because they at one point see it as like a new expansion of the frontier, and the other time they're like, no, like we want to be involved in like making Iowa, making like American identity, right? Like protecting the country, and we can do that through our service in Nicaragua.
Interesting. So you may not know this, but a question came in asking about the typical journey from travelers from Iowa to Nicaragua. Do you know how they got there?
Yeah. So they would generally go down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and then take a steamboat from New Orleans to not to Greytown, but to a different port that was a little smaller, and then take a smaller boats to Greytown. I think what's really interesting is once they get there, like you take a boat, you get to Nicaragua by boat, and you get on a different steamship in Nicaragua and ride it about halfway through the country, at which point there are a bunch of rapids, so you can't take a steamboat through it. So that at that point they switch to some of them walk, some of them get in canoes, some of them get their stuff carried by boatmen, various strategies through the rapids. Then you get to the lake and take a different boat across the lake. Then you get on a donkey with your stuff and go like 2 miles to the coast. So it's like they constantly have to switch which like method of transportation as they go through the country.
That sounds like a fascinating but very time-consuming journey. And this will be our last question. We were asked a question about the future. Do you know anything about the Nicaraguan Canal today? Is it still being worked on?
The last I've heard is I believe there's a attempted negotiations between the Nicaraguan government and the Chinese government on building a canal that might be promising. They've been talking about it for like a decade. In the middle of the 20th century, the U.S. briefly considered using controlled nuclear bombs to create a canal, but that like was immediately seen as like very problematic.
Yeah, I would hope so.
Yeah.
All right. And with that answer, we'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Nathan. We hope that everyone will sign up for the next Iowa History 101 webinar, which takes place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series or to watch recordings, check out our website at history.iowa.gov. And while you are there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as Goldie's Kids Club. We look forward to virtually seeing you here next on October 12th. Thank you again for joining us today and have a great afternoon.